They say no woman could ever win over Silas Mercer, the coldest cowboy on the frontier. But when the only horse he ever trusted collapses on the brink of death, the woman the town despises is the only one who dares to step forward. She says she knows a forgotten remedy, but the price could be both their lives. Can quiet courage save a heart frozen for so many years? Follow the story to the very end. If you enjoyed it, hit like and comment the name of the city you're watching in. Let me know how far my story has come. The horse went down on a Tuesday. No warning, no stumble building over days the way a man might expect. One moment, Ash was standing at the fence line the way he always stood, head low, ears forward, watching the road like he was still waiting for trouble, even after all these years. And the next moment, his front legs buckled and he dropped sideways into the dust with a sound that made Silas Mercer's stomach turn inside out. It wasn't a crash. It was worse than that. It was quiet. The big gray stallion, folded like something vital, had simply switched off inside him, and when he hit the ground, the only sound was the soft thud of 1,100 pounds of muscle meeting dry earth and the sharp exhale of air leaving lungs that didn't want to quit, but couldn't figure out how to keep going. Silas was 40 feet away, mending a fence post that had rotted through at the base. He had the post digger in both hands when it happened. He dropped it mid-swing and ran. "Ash! Hey! Hey, boy!" He was on his knees beside the horse before the dust had settled. His hands moved over the animal's neck, his ribs, feeling for something broken, something wrong, something he could fix. Ash's eyes were open but glassy, and his breathing had gone shallow and fast, too fast. The stallion tried to lift his head once, then gave up and let it rest in the dirt. "Don't do that," Silas said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "Don't you lay there like that." Ash didn't respond. His flanks were trembling. Silas had seen horses die. He'd seen them shot, seen them break legs in prairie dog holes, seen them go down from colic in the middle of the night when there was nothing to do but sit with them until it was over. He knew what dying looked like. He'd held enough animals through it. But this was different. This was Ash. 14 years that horse had carried him. Through the Cimarron crossing when the river rose 6 feet in an hour. Through the winter of '81, when the snow came so thick they'd had to dig out every morning just to find the trail. Through a gunfight outside Wardell when 2 men tried to take his cattle money, and Ash had run 3 miles with a bullet crease along his hindquarter and never once broke stride. Through the years after Catherine left, when Silas didn't talk to another human being for months at a time, and the only living thing that heard his voice was this horse. 14 years. And now the gray was lying in the dirt, and Silas couldn't figure out what was wrong. He stayed there for a long time, long enough that the shadows moved and the afternoon light shifted from white to gold. He got water from the well and tried to get Ash to drink. The horse took a little, then turned his head away. Silas wet his bandana and pressed it against the stallion's neck, feeling the heat there, the fever burning under the skin. "All right," he said quietly. "All right. I'm going to get help." He saddled the bay mare. A decent horse, but nothing special. A horse he'd bought because he needed a second animal for pack work and ranch chores. She was skittish and didn't like the smell coming off Ash, whatever it was, and she danced sideways when Silas tried to mount. He grabbed her ear and pulled her head around until she stopped moving, then swung up and pointed her toward town. Ridgewater sat 7 miles east, a scatter of buildings along a creek that ran dry 3 months out of every year. It wasn't much of a town. General store, feedlot, a saloon called the Rusty Spur that served whiskey so bad it could strip varnish, and a livery stable run by a man named Hector Pruitt, who'd been shoeing horses since before most people in the territory were born. Silas found Hector in the livery, scraping the hoof of a sorrel gelding that belonged to one of the Callaway riders. "I need you to come look at my horse." Hector glanced up. He was a heavy man with enormous forearms and a face that looked like it had been carved from a block of sandstone and then left in the weather for 50 years. "Which one?" "Ash." Something shifted in Hector's expression. Everyone in Ridgewater knew Ash. The gray stallion was as much a landmark as the water tower or the old cottonwood by the church. "What's wrong with him?" "Went down this afternoon. Fever. Won't eat. Won't drink much. I can't find a wound or a break." Hector set down the hoof pick and wiped his hands on his leather apron. "I'll come." They rode back together in the late afternoon heat. Hector didn't say much on the way out. He was the kind of man who saved his words until he had something worth saying, which Silas appreciated because he was the same way. When they reached the ranch, Ash hadn't moved. His eyes were half closed now, and his breathing had gotten worse. Each inhale was a visible effort, his ribs expanding and collapsing like bellows that were wearing out. Hector knelt beside the horse and spent 20 minutes going over every inch of him. He checked the hooves, the teeth, the gums. He pressed his ear against the horse's barrel and listened. He lifted the tail and checked underneath. He felt along the legs, the joints, the spine. When he stood up, his face told Silas everything before his mouth did. "I've seen this twice before," Hector said slowly. "Once in a cavalry horse down in Fort Benson, and once in a Comanche pony that wandered into Dutch Harper's place about 6 years back. And both times the horse was dead inside a week." The words landed like a fist. Silas felt them in his chest, in the hollow space behind his ribs where he kept the things he didn't let anyone see. "What is it?" "I don't rightly know what to call it. It's like the blood goes bad. The fever comes on fast and then the muscles start to give out. The horse gets weaker and weaker until he just—" Hector made a small gesture with his hand. "Stops. There's got to be something. Silas." Hector's voice was careful, the way a man talks when he's about to say something he knows won't be welcome. "That cavalry horse had 3 Army veterinarians working on him, and they couldn't do a thing. I don't know what causes it, and I don't know how to fix it. I'm sorry." Silas stood there looking at his horse. Ash had opened his eyes again and was watching him the way he'd always watched him, with that steady, patient gaze that seemed to say, "I'm still here. Whatever you need, I'm still here." "How long?" Silas asked. "A week, maybe. Maybe less." Silas nodded. He didn't thank Hector. He didn't say anything else. He just stood there until Hector understood that the conversation was over, and the old farrier mounted his horse and rode back toward town without another word. The news traveled the way news always traveled in a small territory, fast, crooked, and gathering details that weren't true along the way. By the next morning, half of Ridgewater knew that Silas Mercer's horse was dying, and by the afternoon the story had grown legs and walked itself into every kitchen and saloon within 20 miles. "Heard it's the swamp fever," said Tom Calloway, leaning against the bar at the rusty spur with a whiskey he'd been nursing for an hour. Tom was the eldest of the 3 Calloway brothers who ran the biggest cattle operation in the valley. He was a tall man with a wide jaw and small eyes that always seemed to be calculating something. "Horse is done for." "Shame," said Virgil Dean, who ran the general store and knew everything about everybody because everybody had to buy flour and salt from somewhere. "That's a hell of a horse." "Was a hell of a horse," Tom corrected. He took a sip of his whiskey. "What's Mercer going to do without him? Man's barely holding that ranch together as it is." This was true, and everyone at the bar knew it. Silas Mercer's place, 240 acres of marginal grassland pressed up against the eastern foothills, had been struggling for 3 years. The drought had hit him harder than most because his water rights were shaky and his creek ran thin by August. He'd lost 30 head of cattle last winter to a combination of cold and bad luck, and he hadn't been able to replace them. The fences were in bad shape. The barn needed a new roof. The house itself was sound enough, but it had the look of a place that was being maintained by one man doing the work of 4 and falling behind a little more every season. "Maybe he'll finally sell," Tom said, and there was something in his voice, something careful and practiced, that made Virgil glance at him sideways. "Sell to who?" Tom shrugged, but it was the kind of shrug that had an answer hiding behind it. "Someone who could do something with that land. That northeast section of his backs right up to our summer pasture. Good grass up there if a man had enough cattle to use it." Virgil didn't say anything to that. He'd been in Ridgewater long enough to know when a man was talking about buying and when he was talking about taking, and the line between the two got blurry when the Calloways were involved. The other 2 Calloway brothers, Marcus and Judd, had their own opinions about Silas and his ranch, and they shared them freely with anyone who'd listen. Marcus was the middle brother, built like a stump with a mean streak that ran deeper than most people realized. Judd was the youngest, soft-spoken and shrewd in a way that made people underestimate him until it was too late. Together, The three of them controlled nearly 8,000 acres and employed a dozen riders, and they'd been eyeing Silas's land the way a cat eyes a wounded bird, patient, watchful, waiting for the right moment. But Silas Mercer was not an easy man to push. That was the thing about him. That was what made the widows and the ranch families and all the respectable women of the territory shake their heads in frustration. The man was like a fence post set in stone. He didn't bend, he didn't lean, and he sure as hell didn't move just because somebody wanted him to. It hadn't always been that way. There had been a time, years back, when Silas was different, when he laughed sometimes. When he went to the Saturday dances at the Grange Hall and stood along the wall with the other young men, watching the girls spin past in their cotton dresses, and once or twice he'd even danced himself. That was before Catherine. Catherine Avery had come out from Missouri with her father in the spring of '78. She was pretty in a sharp-featured way, with dark hair and a quick mind and a laugh that could make a man forget what he'd been worried about. Silas had courted her for 8 months. Quiet courtship, the way he did everything, but steady and real. He'd built an addition onto the house for her. He'd bought new furniture. He'd even ordered curtains from a catalog, which was something no one in Ridgewater had ever seen Silas Mercer do before or since. They were married in October. By February, she was gone. She left with a horse trader named Sullivan, who came through the territory selling remounts to the army. She didn't leave a note. She didn't say goodbye. She just packed her things into Sullivan's wagon one morning while Silas was out checking fence line and rode away. He came home to an empty house with curtain rods and no curtains, and a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. He never talked about it. Not once. When people asked, and they did ask, because frontier communities had short memories for their own troubles and long memories for everyone else's, he just looked at them with those flat gray eyes and said nothing until they stopped asking. After Catherine, the proposals started coming. Not romantic proposals, practical ones. The frontier was full of women who needed husbands and men who needed wives, and the arrangement was usually more about survival than sentiment. Widow Hargrove, who had 300 acres and 4 children and needed a man who could work, sent word through Virgil Dean that she'd be pleased to discuss terms. The Patterson family offered their eldest daughter, a solid, sensible girl named Ruth, who could butcher a hog and break a horse and run a household with the efficiency of a military supply officer. Even old Mrs. Calloway, Tom's mother, before she passed, had suggested quietly that a connection between the families might benefit everyone. Silas turned them all down. Politely, at first, and then with a bluntness that bordered on rude when people didn't get the message. He wasn't interested. He wasn't going to be interested. He had his ranch, and he had his horse. And that was the full extent of what he was willing to trust, and anyone who didn't like it could go find someone else to worry about. The territory accepted this the way it accepted all immovable things, with a mixture of annoyance and grudging respect. Silas Mercer was a hard man to like, but he was a harder man to dismiss. He worked his land honestly. He paid his debts on time. He didn't cheat at cards, didn't water his whiskey, and didn't bother anyone who didn't bother him first. In a country where half the population was running from something and the other half was chasing something, that counted for a lot. But now Ash was dying, and the equation was changing. Silas spent 3 days trying everything he knew. He brewed teas from willow bark and prairie sage and tried to get the horse to drink them. He made poultices from mud and herbs and packed them around Ash's legs where the muscles had started to waste. He sat up through 2 nights watching the horse breathe, counting the breaths, measuring the intervals between them, looking for any sign at all, that things were turning around. They weren't. On the 3rd morning, Ash couldn't lift his head anymore. He lay on his side in the paddock, where Silas had dragged an old canvas tarp to keep the sun off him, and his breathing had gone rough and ragged, each inhale accompanied by a wet rattle that made Silas's jaw tighten every time he heard it. He was sitting on an overturned bucket beside the horse, and not doing anything, just sitting, when he heard the sound of a wagon coming up the road. He didn't look up. People had been coming by for 3 days. Neighbors, mostly, some out of genuine concern and some out of curiosity, wanting to see the great Silas Mercer brought low by the loss of a horse. He'd sent them all away. He didn't want company. He didn't want advice. He especially didn't want the look they all gave him, that careful mixture of pity and satisfaction that people wore when someone they'd always resented was finally going through something they could feel superior about. The wagon stopped. He heard someone climb down. Light footsteps, not the heavy thud of a man's boots. Then a woman's voice, quiet but clear. "Mr. Mercer?" He looked up. She was standing about 20 feet away, just outside the fence. She was young, mid-20s maybe, and small, the kind of small that made people overlook her in a room even when she was standing right in front of them. Her dress was plain brown cotton, patched at the elbows, and her hair was pulled back in a braid that hung over one shoulder. She had a face that was easy to forget. Not ugly, not pretty, just ordinary in a way that slid right past you unless you were paying attention. Silas had seen her around town. Whitlock. That was the name. She lived with her uncle outside Ridgewater, an old man named Cyrus Whitlock, who'd come west after the war and never quite found his footing. She worked at the feedlot sometimes, and at Virgil's store when he needed extra help, and she kept to herself in a way that was different from how Silas kept to himself. His solitude was a wall he'd built on purpose. Hers looked more like something that had been built around her by other people's indifference. "I know what's wrong with your horse," she said. Silas looked at her for a long moment. "Everyone knows what's wrong with my horse. He's dying. He doesn't have to." He almost laughed. Almost. It would have been the first time he'd laughed in weeks, but it died in his throat because of the way she was looking at him. Steady, serious, without any of the eagerness or desperation he'd expected. She wasn't trying to sell him anything. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was stating a fact the way someone states a fact and waiting for him to decide what to do with it. "Hector Pruitt says there's no cure," Silas said. "Hector Pruitt is a good farrier and a decent man, but he's wrong about this." "And you know better?" "About this, yes." He should have sent her away. That was what he did with everyone. Thanked them for coming, told them he was handling it, and watched them ride off feeling like they'd done their duty. But something about her stopped him. Maybe it was the steadiness. Maybe it was the fact that she wasn't fidgeting or explaining or trying to convince him. She was just standing there, waiting, as if she had all the time in the world, and the next move was his. "How?" he asked. "There's an herb that grows in the high canyons, up past where Dutchman's Creek splits. My mother knew about it. She used it once on a mule that had the same thing, the fever, the muscle wasting, all of it. The mule recovered. Took about 2 weeks, but he recovered completely." "Your mother?" "She grew up with the Nez Perce, spent 12 years with them before she married my father. She learned things most people have forgotten if they ever knew them in the first place." Silas studied her. Her hands were rough, working hands, and she stood with her weight evenly balanced, the way someone stands who spent time on uneven ground. She wasn't nervous, she wasn't performing. She was just there. "That canyon country is dangerous," he said. "I know. Cats up there, and worse. I know that too. And you want to ride up there for a horse that isn't yours." Something changed in her face. Not much, just a slight tightening around the eyes, a hardness that appeared and disappeared so quickly he almost missed it. "I want to ride up there because he can be saved and nobody else is going to do it. If you'd rather sit here and watch him die because I'm not the right kind of person to help, that's your choice. But I thought you were the kind of man who cared more about results than appearances." The words hung in the air between them. Silas felt them land, felt the small, sharp edge of truth in them. He looked at Ash. The horse's eye was half open, watching him, still watching, still waiting. "When do you want to leave?" Silas asked. "Now, today. The longer we wait, the harder it gets." He stood up from the bucket. His knees popped. He was 41 years old, and his body reminded him of it at every opportunity. "I need an hour to get things ready." "I'll be here." He went inside the house to pack. While he was pulling supplies from the pantry, hardtack, dried beef, coffee, a tin of peaches he'd been saving, he heard another horse approaching. He went to the window and saw Tom Calloway riding up the road on that big chestnut gelding he favored, sitting the saddle like a man who owned everything he could see and some things he couldn't. Silas went out onto the porch. Tom pulled up and looked at Lena, who was still standing by the fence, and then at Silas. His expression was somewhere between amused and confused. Morning, Silas. Heard about Ash. Came to see if there's anything I could do. Nothing to do. Tom leaned forward in the saddle, resting his forearms on the horn. Listen, I've been thinking. If that horse doesn't make it, and Hector says he won't, you're going to be in a tough spot. Short on animals, short on hands, and winter's coming in about 4 months. I want to make you a fair offer on the northeast quarter. Good grass up there, and you're not using it for much these days anyway. Not selling. Think about it at least. I'm talking a fair price, better than fair. You could use that money to restock, fix up the house, maybe even... I said I'm not selling, Tom. Tom's jaw tightened just slightly. He was used to getting his way. Not through force, usually, but through patience and pressure and the steady, relentless application of economic gravity. People who owed him money sold to him. People who needed his goodwill sold to him. Eventually, most people sold to him. All right, Tom said. Your call. He glanced at Lena again. Who's this? None of your business. Just being friendly, Silas. Be friendly somewhere else. Tom held his gaze for a moment, then smiled. A thin, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes, and turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. Silas watched him go and felt the familiar weight of something he couldn't quite name, not fear. He'd stopped being afraid of the Callaways years ago. It was more like weariness. The exhaustion of knowing that some fights never ended, they just paused between rounds. He wants your land, Lena said from the fence. He's wanted it for 5 years. He'll use this against you, the horse being sick, you leaving the ranch. Silas looked at her. You think I don't know that? I think you know it, and you're going anyway. That tells me something. What's it tell you? That the horse matters more than the land. He didn't answer that. He went back inside and finished packing. They left within the hour. Silas rode the bay mare and packed supplies on a mule he borrowed from Hector's livery. Lena rode her own horse, a scrappy little paint gelding that looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts but moved through the terrain with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat. She carried a canvas sack of her own supplies and a worn leather satchel that she kept close and never let anyone touch. Before they left, Silas asked his nearest neighbor, a quiet, reliable man named Emmett Dawes, to check on Ash twice a day. Emmett agreed without asking questions, which was one of the things Silas liked about him. He just nodded, said he'd handle it, and went back to his own work. The canyon country started about 15 miles northwest of Ridgewater, where the flat grassland buckled upward into a series of broken ridges and narrow valleys that had been carved by ancient water and modern neglect. Nobody ranched up there. The terrain was too rough for cattle, the trails too narrow for wagons, and the wildlife too aggressive for anyone who wasn't willing to accept a certain level of daily risk. Mountain lions were common, bears showed up in the early spring and late fall. And there were rumors of worse things, men who'd gone up into the canyons and decided they liked the lawlessness of it, men who lived off stolen cattle and robbed anyone unlucky enough to cross their path. Silas had been up there once, years ago, tracking a steer that had wandered off during a drive. He'd found the steer, dead, killed by a cat, and he'd come back down and decided that was enough canyon country for one lifetime. Now he was riding back in with a woman he barely knew, chasing an herb he'd never heard of, to save a horse that everyone said was already dead. The first few miles were easy enough. Open ground, gentle slopes, the kind of riding that let your mind wander. Silas kept his eyes on the trail and his thoughts on Ash and tried not to think about what would happen if this didn't work, if the herb wasn't there, if Lena was wrong, if he came back to find the gray stallion cold and stiff in the paddock. Lena rode beside him without talking. She handled her horse well. Better than well, actually. She rode with an easy, unconscious competence that spoke of thousands of hours in the saddle, the kind of riding that became automatic, like breathing. He noticed that she kept scanning the terrain as they moved, not nervously, but systematically, the way someone does who's been trained to watch for things. After about an hour, the trail narrowed and started climbing, and Silas pulled up to let the horses rest. They stopped in a stand of juniper that offered some shade, and Silas dismounted and checked the mule's packs while Lena watered her paint from a canvas bag. "How far?" he asked. 2 days up, maybe 3, depending on weather. The herb grows at elevation, near water, where the rock faces get afternoon sun. There's a specific drainage I'm looking for. My mother described it to me. Two forks of a creek coming together below a red cliff face. You've never been there yourself? She looked at him directly. No. So we're riding into canyon country on directions from a dead woman about a place you've never seen to find a plant you've never picked. That's about the size of it. He stared at her. She stared back. Neither of them blinked. My mother was the smartest person I've ever known, Lena said, and there was no defensiveness in her voice, just a plain statement of something she held to be true. She kept notebooks, drawings, descriptions, locations, everything she learned from the Nez Perce, everything she figured out on her own. I have those notebooks. The herb is real, the place is real, and the cure works. The only question is whether we can find it in time. And if we can't, then we'll have tried, which is more than anyone else in that town is willing to do. Silas thought about Tom Calloway leaning on his saddle horn, offering to buy the northeast quarter. He thought about Hector shaking his head, the sorry already forming on his lips before the examination was finished. He thought about all the people in Ridgewater who'd heard the news and thought, well, that's the end of Silas Mercer. All right, he said, let's keep moving. They rode through the afternoon as the terrain got progressively rougher. The trail, if you could call it a trail, switchbacked up a series of ridges that offered long views of the country below. From up here, the grassland looked peaceful and small, a patchwork of brown and faded green stretching to the horizon. Silas's ranch was a tiny square of fenced land in the middle distance, and beyond it, the Calloway spread sprawled across the valley like a stain. By late afternoon, they'd entered the canyons proper. The walls rose on either side, red and tan sandstone layered in bands that told the story of 1,000,000 years of rising and falling seas. The air was cooler here, shaded by the high walls, and the sounds changed. The open wind of the plains gave way to the contained echoes of narrow spaces, where every footfall and every stone kicked loose seemed to bounce back and forth between the walls before finally fading. Lena navigated with the confidence of someone who'd studied maps until they were memorized. She checked landmarks against notes she pulled from the leather satchel. A small, hand-bound notebook filled with tight, careful handwriting and detailed sketches of rock formations, plants, and animal tracks. Your mother wrote all this? Silas asked, glancing at the notebook when she held it open to compare a sketch to the cliff face ahead of them. Every day for 20 years. She said knowledge that wasn't written down was knowledge that died with you. Smart woman. She was. She also said that most people would rather stay comfortable and wrong than get uncomfortable and learn something. I think about that a lot. They made camp that evening in a shallow overhang where the rock curved out far enough to provide shelter without boxing them in. Silas built a small fire. Small because he didn't want to advertise their position, and because wood was scarce up here, and they ate hardtack and dried beef and drank coffee that Lena brewed in a battered tin pot she pulled from her satchel. The fire threw moving shadows on the rock walls. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote started up, and then another one answered, and then a third, until the canyon was full of their sharp, broken music. You live with your uncle, Silas said. It wasn't a question. Uncle Cyrus. Yes. He's a good man? Lena was quiet for a moment, turning a piece of hardtack in her hands. He's a tired man. He came out here after the war thinking he could start fresh, but I don't think he ever figured out what starting fresh actually meant. He drinks too much, and he doesn't work enough, and he forgets to eat if I don't put food in front of him. But he took me in when my mother died, and he never made me feel like I was a burden, even when I probably was. When did she die? Your mother. 6 years ago. Pneumonia. She was strong right up until the end, and then she wasn't, and that was it. Lena's voice was matter-of-fact, but Silas heard the edges of something underneath. Not grief, exactly, but the scar tissue that grief leaves behind. She'd have liked your horse, by the way. She always said you could tell everything about a person by how their animals looked, and from what I've seen of Ash, you've taken good care of him. He's taken good care of me. That's usually how it works. The good ones take care of each other. They sat in silence for a while. The fire burned down to coals, and the stars came out above the canyon rim. Hard, bright points in a sky so dark it seemed to have weight. Silas rolled out his bedroll and lay on his back, looking up at them, and for the first time in 3 days, the knot in his chest loosened just slightly. Not because he was hopeful. Hope was a luxury he'd given up a long time ago, but because he was doing something, moving, acting, fighting for the one thing in his life that had never let him down. He fell asleep to the sound of the coyotes and the quiet rhythm of Lena's breathing across the dying fire. The second day was harder. The trail, such as it was, climbed steeply through a series of narrow switchbacks that forced them to dismount and lead the horses by hand. The mule balked twice, and both times Silas had to unload the packs, carry them up the worst section on his own back, and then coax the animal up after him. The bay mare handled it better but wasn't happy about it, and by midday both horses were lathered and blowing hard. Lena's paint moved through it like water through a pipe, finding footholds that shouldn't have existed, picking his way across loose scree with the delicate precision of a ballet dancer. Silas watched the horse with grudging admiration. "Where'd you get that animal?" he asked during a rest stop. "Found him. He was running wild up past the Tolliver place about 4 years ago. Skin and bones, full of burrs, mean as a snake. Nobody wanted him because he bit and he kicked and he wouldn't let anyone near him." "How'd you catch him?" "I didn't. I sat down in a meadow and waited. Took 3 days. On the third day, he walked up to me and put his nose on my shoulder and stood there. I put a rope on him and led him home, and he's never given me a moment's trouble since. 3 days sitting in a meadow. Patience isn't popular, Mr. Mercer, but it works on almost everything. Call me Silas. We're past last names." She looked at him with something that might have been surprise, or might have been satisfaction, or might have been nothing at all. "All right, Silas." In the early afternoon, they came around a bend in the canyon and found the trail blocked by a rock slide. Not a fresh one. The rocks had been there long enough for moss to grow on their north faces. But it was complete. The trail was buried under 15 feet of broken stone, and the canyon walls on either side were too steep to climb. Silas stood at the base of the slide and looked up at it and felt something cold settle in his stomach. "How do we get around this?" Lena was already studying the canyon wall to their left. She ran her hand along the rock, testing surfaces, looking for cracks and ledges. After a few minutes, she walked 50 yards back down the trail and pointed up at a narrow shelf that ran diagonally up the wall. Not a path, not even a ledge, really. More like a suggestion carved into the rock by centuries of water runoff. "There," she said. "That's not a trail." "It doesn't need to be a trail. It needs to be wide enough for the horses." "It's not wide enough for the horses." "It's close." Silas looked at the shelf. It was maybe 3 feet wide at its broadest and narrowed to less than 2 feet in places. Below it was a 40-foot drop to the canyon floor. Above it was smooth, unclimbable rock. "The mule won't make it," he said. "Then we leave the mule and take what we can carry." He looked at her. She was serious. She was always serious, he was beginning to realize. Not in a dour way, but in the way of someone who'd learned early that the world didn't have much patience for frivolity and had adjusted accordingly. They redistributed the supplies. What they couldn't carry, they cached under a rock overhang with a tarp and a prayer. Not to any deity, just the kind of prayer a man sends out into the universe when he knows the odds are bad and the alternatives are worse. Then Silas tied the mule to a juniper where it would have shade and some scrub to nibble on, and they started up the shelf. It was terrifying. There was no other word for it. The shelf was barely wide enough for the horses, and in places it crumbled under their hooves, sending little cascades of rock and dirt into the void below. The bay mare trembled and snorted and refused to move twice, and both times Silas had to stand on the edge of nothing, holding her head, talking to her in a low, steady voice until she took the next step. Lena's paint walked the shelf as if it were a highway. He didn't even look down. "That horse isn't natural," Silas muttered when they reached the other side and he could breathe again. "He grew up in country like this. It's normal to him." "Nothing about this is normal." They rested on the far side of the slide, both of them breathing hard. The horses from effort, the humans from something closer to controlled panic. Silas sat on a boulder and drank from his canteen and tried to stop his hands from shaking. They wouldn't. He put them in his pockets and waited. You did well back there, Lena said. I almost threw up. Well, you didn't. That's what counts. He looked at her. She was sitting on a flat rock, her boots hanging over the edge, completely at ease. The woman who'd been dismissed by every person in Ridgewater as insignificant was sitting on the edge of a cliff in the middle of canyon country, as calmly as if she were on her uncle's porch. You're not what people think you are, he said. People don't think about me at all, Silas. That's different. There was no self-pity in it, just observation. And he recognized the feeling behind it because he'd known it himself. That particular loneliness of being invisible, not because you're hiding, but because nobody's looking. They pushed on through the afternoon. The canyon opened up slightly as they climbed, and the vegetation changed. More pine, less juniper, and the first wildflowers Silas had seen in months. There was water here, too. A thin stream running along the canyon floor, clear and cold, fed by snowmelt from somewhere above. The horses drank deeply, and Silas refilled the canteens and felt the first fragile stirring of something he refused to call hope. Just before dark, Lena stopped and pulled out the notebook again. She studied a particular page for a long time, looking up at the rock formations ahead of them and then back down at the sketch. We're close, she said. The fork should be just past that next ridge. If my mother's notes are right, the red cliff is on the south face, and the herb grows in the drainage below it. If she's right. She was always right about plants, about animals, about weather. The only thing she was wrong about was people. She thought they'd be better than they turned out to be. They made camp in a grove of aspens where the stream widened into a pool. The water was achingly cold and clean, and Silas washed the dust from his face and hands and sat on a log watching the last light climb the canyon walls. The aspens trembled around them, their leaves making that sound, that particular papery whisper, that always made him think of things he couldn't put into words. Tell me something, Lena said from across the fire. All those women who wanted to marry you, the widows, the ranch daughters, why did you turn them all down? That's a personal question. We've been riding together for 2 days through country that's trying to kill us. I think we're past polite. He was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. An owl called somewhere above the canyon rim. Because they didn't want me, he said finally. They wanted what I had, the ranch, the reputation, the idea of Silas Mercer. None of them ever bothered to find out whether the real thing was worth having. And Catherine. The name hit him like a slap, even after all these years. He looked at her sharply. You know about that. Everyone knows about that, Silas. Small town, long memories. He worked his jaw. Catherine wanted something I couldn't give her. I don't know what it was. Excitement, maybe. A bigger life. I was never enough for her, and I didn't figure that out until she was gone. That must have been hard. It was a long time ago. Time doesn't make everything smaller. Some things just sit there, the same size they always were, waiting for you to deal with them. He looked at her across the fire, and for the first time since she'd shown up at his fence, he felt something crack open inside him, just a little, just enough to let in a sliver of light. Not attraction, not trust, something more fundamental than either of those. Recognition. The sense that he was looking at someone who understood something about the world that most people didn't, and who had arrived at that understanding the same way he had, through loss and disappointment, and the slow, hard work of keeping going anyway. We should sleep, he said. Early start. Early start, she agreed. And she rolled over in her bedroll and closed her eyes, and Silas sat by the fire for a long time after that, watching the embers glow and listening to the stream and the aspens and the vast, complicated silence of the mountains. In the morning, they would either find the herb or they wouldn't. They would save Ash or they wouldn't. But for the first time in years, maybe for the first time since Catherine, Silas Mercer was not alone. And the fact of it settled over him like a blanket he hadn't known he needed, warm and strange and terrifying in equal measure. He fed the fire one more stick and lay down and closed his eyes and let the mountains hold him. They found the red cliff on the third morning, just as the sun broke over the eastern rim and turned the canyon walls from gray to copper to a deep, burning orange that looked like the inside of a forge. Lena saw it first. She pulled up her paint and sat still in the saddle, one hand shading her eyes, the other holding the notebook open on her thigh. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just looked at the cliff face, and then down at the page, and then back at the cliff, and Silas watched something move across her face. Not relief, not triumph, but something quieter and more private, like a conversation she was having with someone who wasn't there anymore. "That's it," she said finally. Silas looked up. The cliff rose maybe 200 feet above the canyon floor, its face stained in bands of deep red and rust and ochre. At its base, two forks of a narrow creek came together in a tangle of rocks and fallen timber, and the ground around the junction was thick with vegetation. Ferns, mosses, and a dozen plants he couldn't name growing in the constant spray of the converging waters. "She drew it exactly," Lena said, holding up the notebook. And she had. The sketch on the page matched the scene in front of them with an accuracy that bordered on uncanny. Every ledge, every crack, every angle of the rock. Her mother had stood in this exact spot, maybe 20 years ago, and drawn what she saw with the precision of a cartographer and the eye of an artist. "Your mother was something," Silas said. "She really was." They dismounted and picketed the horses near the creek where they could drink. Lena was already moving through the vegetation at the base of the cliff, crouching low, pushing aside ferns, searching. She worked methodically, moving in a grid pattern from the water's edge outward, checking each plant against a detailed drawing in the notebook. Silas wanted to help, but didn't know what he was looking for. "What does it look like?" Low to the ground, thick, fleshy leaves, almost like a succulent, but darker, deep green with purple veins underneath. It should have small white flowers this time of year, tiny ones, no bigger than a pinhead. It grows in the cracks where the rock meets the soil, usually on the north-facing side where it stays damp. He started looking. It was slow, tedious work, crawling on hands and knees through wet ground, checking every plant, finding nothing. The cliff base was lush with growth, but most of it was common stuff: columbine, monkeyflower, maidenhair fern. Nothing matching Lena's description. An hour passed, then two. The sun climbed higher and the shadows retreated up the cliff face, and the air in the canyon grew warm and still. Silas's knees ached from crawling, and his back had started the deep, persistent throb that reminded him he wasn't 30 anymore and hadn't been for a while. "Maybe it's not here," he said, sitting back on his heels and wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Maybe the season's wrong, or it doesn't grow here anymore." "It's here." Lena didn't look up. She was working a section of the cliff base where a thin sheet of water seeped down the rock face and disappeared into a carpet of moss. "My mother said it hides. That's the word she used. Hides, like it doesn't want to be found." That's a hell of a quality in a medicine. Most things worth finding don't make it easy. He went back to looking. Another 30 minutes passed. He was about to say something else, something less patient this time, when Lena made a sound. Not a word, just a sharp intake of breath, quick and involuntary, like someone touching something they'd been told was impossible. "Here." He went to her. She was kneeling in a narrow crack where the cliff face met the ground at an angle, almost invisible behind a curtain of hanging moss. When she pulled the moss aside, he saw it. A small, low-growing plant with thick, dark green leaves that hugged the rock. The leaves were unremarkable from above, but when Lena carefully turned one over, the underside was laced with fine purple veins, exactly as described. And there, barely visible among the leaves, were tiny white flowers no bigger than grains of rice. "That's the one?" "That's the one. Bitterroot's cousin. That's what my mother called it. The Nez Perce had another name, but she could never get the pronunciation right, so she just drew pictures." Lena's hands were shaking slightly as she reached for the plant, and Silas noticed that and filed it away. She'd been steady through everything. That's the cliffs, the narrow shelf, 2 days of hard riding through dangerous country. And this was what made her shake. Not the danger, the finding. She pulled a small knife from her satchel and began carefully cutting stems, taking only what she needed, leaving the root system intact. "My mother's notes say you dry the leaves and steep them in hot water for 4 hours. Not boiling, just hot. Then you strain it and mix it with rendered fat to make a paste. The paste goes on the chest, the neck, the joints, and you give the tea by mouth, as much as the animal will take. 4 hours for a tea. The compounds have to break down slowly. Rush it, and you get nothing. My mother said patience is the ingredient that can't be bought. Silas watched her work. She cut with precision, selecting specific stems, rejecting others, choosing leaves of a certain size and color, and rejecting ones that were too young or too old. She knew what she was doing. Whatever else people thought about Lena Whitlock, whatever they'd decided she was or wasn't based on her patched dress and her quiet manner and her invisible place in the social order of Ridgewater, the woman knew exactly what she was doing. "How much do we need?" he asked. "Enough for 7 days of treatment, twice a day. That's the protocol my mother outlined. 7 days minimum, and you don't stop even if the horse starts improving because the fever can come back if you cut short." She filled her canvas bag about halfway, and then stopped and studied the remaining plants with a worried expression. "I want to take more, but I can't. If I strip too much, this colony might not come back. There aren't many places this grows." "You're worried about the plant when my horse is dying." She looked up at him, and her expression was complicated, patient, frustrated, and something else he couldn't read. "I'm worried about everything, Silas. Your horse, this plant, the ride back, what the Callaways might be doing while we're gone. I'm worried about all of it, but worry that makes you stupid isn't worth anything, so I'm going to worry smart and take what we need and leave enough for next time." He didn't argue with that. He was learning not to argue with her, which was a new experience for a man who'd spent most of his adult life arguing with everything and everyone, including the weather. They packed up the herbs carefully, wrapping the cut stems in damp cloth to keep them fresh, and started back down the canyon by midday. The return trip should have been faster, downhill, known trail, nothing to search for. But the mountains had other plans. The clouds that had been building along the western rim all morning thickened and darkened through the afternoon, and by the time they reached the narrow section below the rock slide, the sky had turned the color of a week-old bruise, and the wind had picked up enough to make the horses nervous. "Storm coming," Silas said, pulling up and studying the sky. "More than a storm. Look at the color. That's hail." He looked. She was right. The clouds had that particular green-gray tint that meant ice, and lots of it. In open country, hail was miserable but survivable. In a narrow canyon with steep walls and loose rock, it was something else entirely. "We need shelter, now." They pushed hard for the next mile, both of them scanning the canyon walls for an overhang or a cave, anything that would keep the worst of it off them. The wind was howling now, funneled by the narrow canyon into something that sounded like a freight train, and the first drops of rain hit them like thrown pebbles, hard and stinging and cold. Lena found it, a deep overhang in the southern wall, maybe 20 feet up from the canyon floor, accessible by a rough scramble up a talus slope. They led the horses up as fast as they dared, the animals sliding and scrambling on the loose rock, and crowded under the overhang just as the sky opened up. The hail came down like the world was ending. Stones the size of marbles at first, then bigger. Big as walnuts, big as eggs, hammering the canyon floor with a roar that drowned out everything else. The creek below them turned brown and swelled, rising visibly as the runoff poured off the cliff faces and into the drainage. Within 20 minutes, the thin stream they'd been following was a churning, muddy torrent 3 feet deep and rising. "If we'd been down there," Silas started. "We're not. That's what matters." They huddled under the overhang with the horses pressed against the rock behind them, and they waited. The hail lasted 30 minutes and then shifted to hard, driving rain that lasted another hour. When it finally eased to a steady drizzle, the canyon floor was a mess. Rocks displaced, vegetation flattened, the trail they'd been following completely obscured by mud and debris. "We can't go down tonight," Lena said, looking at the swollen creek. "That water won't drop until morning." Silas knew she was right, but the knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone. Every hour they spent here was an hour Ash spent lying in the dirt back at the ranch, getting weaker, getting closer to the point where no herb in the world would make a difference. "He's tough," Lena said, reading his face in a way that unsettled him. "That horse has been fighting for you for 14 years. He'll hold on." "You don't know that." "No, I don't. But I know that getting ourselves killed trying to ford a flooded creek in the dark won't help him. We rest. We wait for daylight. We move." They made a cold camp. No fire, because everything was soaked, and ate the last of the hardtack and dried beef. The rain continued through the evening, lighter now but steady, and the sound of it on the rock above their heads was constant, almost hypnotic. In the dim light, Silas could see Lena's profile as she sat against the wall, the notebook open in her lap. She was reading by the fading light, tracing her fingers over the pages the way a person touches something precious. "Your uncle?" Silas said. "Does he know where you are?" "I told him I was going into the canyons. He said I was foolish." "He didn't try to stop you." "Uncle Cyrus stopped trying to stop me from doing things about 4 years ago. He figured out it was a waste of effort." "Smart man." "In some ways. In others, not at all. He had a wife once before the war. Margaret. He never talks about her, but I found a daguerreotype in his things when I was cleaning the house. Pretty woman. Hard eyes, though. The kind of eyes that don't forgive much." She paused, turning a page in the notebook. "I think that's why he drinks. Not because of the war, the way everyone assumes, but because of Margaret. Because he gave up something real for something that turned out not to be, and he couldn't figure out how to get back to where he started." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You're talking about me now." "Am I?" "Catherine. The widows. Giving up on people because one person gave up on me. I wasn't comparing you to Uncle Cyrus." "But you were thinking it." She closed the notebook and looked at him through the dim light. "What I was thinking is that people who've been hurt build walls, and the walls keep out the bad things, but they keep out the good things too. And after a while, the person behind the wall can't tell the difference anymore. Everything looks like a threat. Everything feels like it might turn into another Catherine." The words landed somewhere deep, in a place Silas had spent years armoring against exactly this kind of insight. He wanted to dismiss it, to give her the flat stare and the silence that sent everyone else packing. But he couldn't, because she wasn't wrong, and they both knew it, and lying to someone who'd just led him through canyon country to save his horse felt like a form of cowardice he wasn't willing to commit. "I'm not good at trusting people," he said. "I know. I might never be. I know that too." She tucked the notebook into her satchel and pulled her blanket around her shoulders. "Nobody's asking you to be good at it, Silas. Just to keep trying. That's all any of us can do." She closed her eyes, and he sat there in the dark, listening to the rain and the creek and the slow, measured sound of her breathing, and something shifted inside him that he couldn't have described even if he'd wanted to. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a revelation. It was more like a door that had been stuck for years, finally loosening in its frame. Not opening yet, not even close, but admitting for the first time that opening was possible. The rain stopped sometime before dawn. When the gray light of morning seeped into the canyon, Silas was already up, checking the horses. The creek had dropped overnight, just as Lena had predicted, still running high and muddy, but passable if they chose their crossing carefully. They were moving within the hour. The canyon floor was slick with mud and littered with debris from the storm. Fallen branches, displaced rocks, patches of sand and gravel that hadn't been there the day before. The horses picked their way through it slowly, and more than once Silas had to dismount and clear the trail by hand, shoving logs and rocks aside so the animals could pass. By midday, they'd reached the spot where they'd left the mule. The animal was still there, standing under his juniper tree, looking wet and annoyed but otherwise unhurt. Silas checked him over, reloaded the packs, and they continued down through the lower canyons toward the flatland. The transition from canyon to open country was always abrupt. One moment the walls were on either side, closing the world down to a narrow strip of sky, and the next moment the land fell away and the horizon opened up in every direction, vast and flat and endless. It always made Silas feel exposed after the shelter of the canyons, like stepping from a dark room into bright sunlight. They were 2 miles out of the canyons, crossing a stretch of open grassland, when Lena pulled up and pointed. "Riders!" Silas looked. 3 men on horseback, maybe half a mile ahead, moving at a walk along the ridgeline. They weren't on any trail he recognized, and they weren't headed toward town. They were paralleling the route Silas and Lena were taking, riding in the same direction at the same pace. "Could be Callaway riders," Silas said. "Could be. Could be anybody. But it's probably not anybody. Not out here. Not going this direction." He watched the riders for another minute. They were staying on the ridge, silhouetted against the sky, either unaware they were being observed or unconcerned about it. One of them turned in the saddle and looked back toward the canyons, toward where Silas and Lena would have been if they hadn't stopped. "They're watching for us," Lena said. "Maybe." "Silas, they're watching for us." He pulled the rifle from the saddle scabbard and checked the load. It was a Winchester 73, well-maintained, capable of putting a round into a man-sized target at 300 yards if the shooter was steady and the wind was kind. Silas was steady and the wind was calm. "We'll swing south," he said. "Add a few miles, but we'll come in from a direction they're not watching. What if there are more of them, farther south? Then we'll deal with that when we get to it." They turned south, leaving the direct route to Ridgewater and cutting across country that was rougher but provided better cover. Low swells of land, shallow draws thick with scrub, the kind of terrain where a horse and rider could move without being seen if they were careful. Silas rode with the rifle across his saddle and his eyes constantly moving, scanning the ridgeline to the north and the open ground to the west. The riders on the ridge didn't follow. Either they hadn't seen Silas and Lena, or they'd decided not to pursue. Either way, Silas didn't relax. He wouldn't relax until he was home and Ash was being treated and the herbs were doing their work. And maybe not even then. "You think the Callaways sent them?" Lena asked as they rode. "I think Tom Callaway knows I left the ranch. I think he knows why. And I think a man who wants my land has every reason to make sure I don't come back with what I went to get. That's a lot of effort over a horse. It's not about the horse. It's about what happens if Ash lives. If Ash recovers, I stay. I keep ranching. I keep holding that land, and Tom Callaway doesn't get his summer pasture. That's worth sending 3 riders to him. That's worth a lot more than that. He's been sabotaging you." It wasn't a question. Silas looked at her. "The cattle you lost last winter," she said. 30 head. I heard about it in town. People said it was the cold, but 30 head is a lot to lose in one winter, even a bad one, especially for a rancher who knows what he's doing. And the drought hitting your land harder than anyone else's. That creek of yours runs off the same watershed as the Callaway property. If someone diverted water upstream, your creek would be the first to go dry. Silas felt something cold move through him. Not surprise. He'd suspected these things for years. Suspected them without quite letting himself think them through to their conclusions, because the conclusions were ugly and he hadn't wanted to face them. But hearing someone else say it out loud, hearing the logic laid out in Lena's careful, factual voice, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "You've been paying attention," he said. "I pay attention to everything. It's one of the advantages of being someone nobody notices. You get to see things that people who matter miss because they're too busy being seen. That's a lonely way to live. It is what it is." They rode in silence for a while. The sun was getting low, painting the grassland in long shadows and warm light, and somewhere to the east a coyote started its evening song, that ragged, rising cry that always sounded to Silas like something between a laugh and a scream. "I need to tell you something," Lena said after a while. "About why I came to you. About Ash." He waited. "It wasn't just because I thought I could save your horse. I mean, I did think that, and I can. But that's not the only reason." "Then what?" She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words. "My mother treated a horse with the same sickness 8 years ago. A mule, technically, but the same disease. She saved the animal. And the owner, a man named Drucker, outside of Fort Benson, he was so grateful that he told everyone in the territory what she'd done. Word spread, and then people started coming to her with their sick animals, and she helped them, and for a little while she had something she'd never had before, respect. People looked at her and saw someone worth knowing. What happened? What always happens. The local stockmen decided she was a threat because she knew things they didn't. They said she was using Indian witchcraft, that her cures were dangerous, that no decent person should let her near their animals. They ran her out of business. She went back to being invisible. And 6 months later, she was dead. The bitterness in Lena's voice was controlled but unmistakable. Not the sharp, reactive bitterness of someone who'd just been hurt, but the deep, weathered bitterness of someone who'd been carrying a wound for years and had learned to walk with it. "I'm sorry," Silas said, and meant it. "I don't need sorry. I need someone who'll stand up and say what she did was real, that her knowledge was real, that the things she learned and the things she taught me have value. no matter what people like the Callaways think about where that knowledge came from. And saving Ash does that. Saving Ash proves it to everyone. The whole territory will hear about it. Silas Mercer's horse, the one everybody said was done for, saved by a cure that nobody believed in. That's not something people can ignore. He rode for a while without speaking, turning this over in his mind. He understood what she was saying, and he understood why it mattered to her, and some part of him, the part that was tired and practical and preferred things simple, wanted to resent being used as a tool for someone else's vindication. But a bigger part of him recognized the justice in it. Her mother had been driven out by the same kind of people who were trying to drive him out. Different methods, same result. Small people with big power using it to crush anyone who didn't fit their idea of how things should be. "We'll save the horse," he said, "and then we'll make sure people know how it happened." She looked at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw something in her face that wasn't composure or determination or careful patience. It was gratitude, raw, unguarded, the kind that comes when someone gives you the one thing you'd given up hoping for. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet. We still have to get home." They pushed hard through the last few miles, riding fast across the open ground as the sun dropped toward the horizon, and the sky turned from blue to gold to that deep, dusty orange that only happened in this country, in this season, when the air was dry and the light had to travel through 100 miles of nothing to reach you. Silas's ranch came into view as the last light was fading, a dark shape against the darker ground, the house and barn and corrals all reduced to silhouettes. And there, in the paddock where he'd left him, a gray shape lying on the ground under the canvas tarp. Silas felt his stomach drop. He kicked the mare into a run, something he almost never did with a tired horse, and covered the last quarter mile in a flat-out gallop. He was out of the saddle before she'd fully stopped, vaulting the fence and running to where Ash lay. The gray stallion was still alive. Barely. His breathing had gotten worse, much worse. Each inhale was a long, wheezing struggle, and each exhale came with a wet rattle that sounded like gravel rolling around in a tin can. His eyes were closed, and when Silas put his hand on the horse's neck, the fever hit him like touching a stove. The skin was burning, dry, radiating heat. "He's worse," Silas said. His voice came out wrong, tight, strangled, like it was being squeezed through a space too narrow for it. Lena was right behind him. She knelt beside the horse and put her hands on him, checking the same things Silas had checked: pulse, temperature, breathing, muscle tension. Her face was calm, but he could see the urgency in her movements, the way she was working quickly without rushing, efficient without panic. "He's bad," she said, "but he's fighting. Feel his pulse. It's weak, but it's steady. That matters. An animal that's given up has an irregular pulse. This horse hasn't given up." "How long before the medicine works?" "The first dose takes about 12 hours to show any effect. Real improvement won't come until day 3 or 4. We have to get the first dose in him tonight." "Then let's do it." Lena took over. She moved through the preparations with a practiced efficiency that told Silas she'd done this before. Maybe not exactly this, but something close enough that her hands knew the motions even if the specific circumstances were new. She built a fire in the yard and heated water in a large pot, not to boiling but to a steady, steaming simmer. She cut the herbs with her knife, separating the leaves from the stems, discarding some parts and keeping others with a selectiveness that looked almost random, but wasn't. "Leaves go in the water," she said, working as she talked. "Stems are for the poultice. The stems have a different concentration of the active compounds. You need both, but they do different things. The tea works from the inside, breaking the fever and clearing the blood. The poultice works from the outside, drawing the poison through the skin." "How do you know all this?" "My mother taught me. From the time I was old enough to hold a knife, she had me working with plants, cutting, drying, mixing, measuring. She said the knowledge had to live in my hands, not just my head, because hands remember things that minds forget." She dropped the cut leaves into the hot water and covered the pot with a flat piece of tin. "That has to steep for 4 hours. While it steeps, I'll make the poultice." She worked through the evening and into the night. The poultice was a thick paste made from crushed stems mixed with rendered fat from Silas's kitchen stores. Not pretty to look at, gray-green and gritty, with a smell that was sharp and herbal and faintly bitter. She applied it to Ash's chest, his neck, the joints of his legs, working it into the coat with slow, careful strokes. Ash didn't resist. He lay there and let her work, occasionally opening one eye to look at her before closing it again. Once, when her hand passed over a particularly tender spot on his barrel, he flinched and made a low sound. Not a whinny, more like a groan, deep and involuntary. And Lena paused and waited until he was still again before continuing. At midnight, the tea was ready. It had turned a dark amber color, almost black, with an astringent smell that made Silas's eyes water. Lena strained it through a piece of muslin twice, then let it cool to just above body temperature. "I need something to pour this into his mouth," she said. "Something with a narrow opening that I can control." Silas went to the barn and came back with an old leather bottle he used for oiling harnesses. It was clean enough. He rinsed it twice and gave it to Lena, and she filled it with the tea and knelt beside Ash's head. "I need you to hold his head up, not high, just enough that the liquid goes down his throat and not into his lungs." Silas got behind the horse and lifted the big gray head into his lap. It was heavier than he expected. Dead weight, almost. The muscles in Ash's neck too weak to help. He cradled the head against his chest and held the jaw steady while Lena tipped the leather bottle and let the tea run in a thin stream into the corner of the horse's mouth. Ash swallowed. Once, then again. The tea went down, and Lena waited, watching, then gave him more. It took 20 minutes to get a full dose into him, a slow, patient process of pour weight, and by the end, Silas's arms were shaking from holding the horse's head, and his shirt was soaked with tea and sweat, and something that might have been tears, but he'd deny it if anyone asked. "That's enough for now," Lena said. "Second dose in 12 hours. Same thing." She sat back on her heels and wiped her hands on her dress, and looked at the horse with an expression that was part clinical assessment and part something more tender. Something she wouldn't have shown if she'd known he was watching. "He's strong," she said quietly. "Most animals would have died by now. The fact that he's held on this long tells me his body wants to fight. The medicine just gives him something to fight with." Silas lowered Ash's head gently back to the ground and sat beside him, his back against the fence post, his legs stretched out in the dirt. He was exhausted, bone-deep, whole-body exhaustion, the kind that comes from days of physical effort combined with the grinding, corrosive fatigue of worry. But he wasn't going to sleep. Not now. Not while Ash was lying here with poison in his blood and a stranger's cure running through his veins. Lena sat down a few feet away and pulled her blanket around her shoulders. The night air was cold, desert cold, the kind that comes on fast after the sun goes down and has teeth in it. "You should rest," she said. "I'll watch him." "I'm not going anywhere." "I know, but you can rest and not go anywhere at the same time. Sit there. Close your eyes. I'll wake you if anything changes." "You need rest too." "I will. After the next dose, but right now I need to watch him. I need to see how he responds in the first few hours, whether the fever breaks, whether his breathing changes. It'll tell me if the dosage is right or if I need to adjust." He looked at her, really looked at her in the flickering light of the yard fire, with the stars scattered across the sky above them, and the gray horse breathing between them. She was tired, too. He could see it in the shadows under her eyes, in the slight droop of her shoulders. But there was something in her posture that wouldn't give in to the tiredness, a core of stubbornness or duty, or maybe just the fierce private determination of someone who has something to prove and knows this might be her only chance to prove it. "You're a stubborn woman, Lena Whitlock." "I prefer determined." "Same thing. Different packaging." She almost smiled. Not quite. Her mouth moved in a way that suggested the smile was available, but she wasn't ready to use it yet. "Get some rest, Silas." He leaned his head back against the fence post and closed his eyes. He didn't think he would sleep, but his body disagreed, and within minutes the exhaustion pulled him under. He dreamed about Catherine. Not the good times. Those dreams had stopped years ago. This dream was about the morning he'd come home and found the house empty. In the dream, the house was always bigger than it actually was, and the silence was louder, and the curtain rods with no curtains were everywhere. In the kitchen, in the bedroom, in rooms that didn't exist in the real house. And he walked through these rooms looking for something he couldn't name, knowing it was gone, knowing he was too late, but unable to stop looking. He woke to Lena's hand on his shoulder and the gray light of dawn. His breathing's changed, she said. He was on his feet in a second, his hand on Ash's neck before his eyes were fully open. The horse was still lying down, still feverish, still weak. But she was right. The breathing was different. The wet rattle was gone. The inhales were still labored but smoother, and the exhales came without that awful gravel sound that had been tearing at Silas's insides for days. Is that good? It's not bad. It means the tea is breaking up whatever's in his lungs. The fever's still high, but it hasn't climbed, which means it's reached its peak, and the medicine is holding it there. If we can hold it for another day, it should start to come down. Should. She met his eyes. I'm not going to promise you miracles, Silas. I'll promise you that I know what I'm doing, and I'll promise you that I'll do everything I can, and I'll promise you that this herb has worked before, and I believe it'll work again. Beyond that, it's up to the horse. He nodded. It was honest, and he appreciated honest. He'd had enough of people telling him what they thought he wanted to hear to last several lifetimes. They fell into a routine over the next 2 days. Every 12 hours, Lena brewed a fresh batch of the tea, and they dosed Ash together, Silas holding the head, Lena pouring. Between doses, she reapplied the poultice, mixed fresh batches when the old ones dried out, and kept meticulous notes in the back of her mother's notebook, recording Ash's temperature, breathing rate, pulse, and the condition of his eyes, gums, and muscles at regular intervals. Silas did the ranch work, what there was of it. He fed the other horses, checked the fence lines, hauled water from the well. Emmett Dawes came by on the first morning back and reported that nothing had happened while Silas was gone. No visitors, no trouble, no Callaways. But his expression said he'd expected otherwise, which told Silas that the whole territory was watching and waiting. Heard you went up into the canyons, Emmett said, glancing at Lena, who was working over the fire with her herbs. With the Whitlock girl. I did. People are talking. Let them. Emmett nodded. He was a good neighbor, the best Silas had, and he had the rare quality of knowing when to stop asking questions. If you need anything, holler. Thanks, Emmett. By the end of the second day, Ash's fever had dropped noticeably. Not broken, not yet, but down from the furnace heat that had been cooking him from the inside. His eyes were open more often, and he was taking water on his own, lifting his head just enough to drink from the bucket Lena kept beside him. Once, in the late afternoon of the second day, he tried to stand. He got his front legs under him and pushed up and got about halfway before his hind legs gave out, and he sank back down with a grunt that sounded more frustrated than pained. Lena was beside him instantly, her hands on his hindquarters, checking the muscles. That's good, she said, and for the first time since Silas had met her, there was something in her voice that sounded like real emotion. Not just competence, not just professional assessment, but actual, undisguised hope. The muscle wasting is slowing down. He's starting to rebuild. Can he make it? She looked up at him, and the answer was in her face before she spoke it. I think so. I think he's going to make it. The news traveled the way news always traveled, fast, crooked, and gathering commentary along the way. Within a day, the story was all over Ridgewater. Silas Mercer's horse was improving. The Whitlock girl, the nobody, the orphan, the invisible one, had gone into the canyons and come back with a cure. People who'd dismissed her for years suddenly had opinions about what she'd done, and very few of those opinions were generous. At the Rusty Spur, Tom Calloway listened to the talk with a face that showed nothing and eyes that showed everything. He sat in his usual spot at the end of the bar, turning his whiskey glass in slow circles. And when people looked at him for a reaction, he just shrugged and said, Horse isn't well yet. Long way between improving and recovered. But that night, Tom rode home to the Calloway Ranch and sat in his office with his brothers. And the conversation that happened behind that closed door was very different from the shrug he'd offered in the saloon. If that horse recovers, Mercer stays, Tom said. He was standing at the window looking out at the dark rangeland. If Mercer stays, we don't get the northeast quarter. We don't get the summer pasture. We don't get the water rights. Everything we've been working toward for 5 years goes sideways because one girl and one horse and some plants from a canyon. So what do we do? Marcus asked. He was sitting in a chair by the fireplace, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife, which was something he did when he was thinking about hurting someone. We make sure the horse doesn't recover. How? Tom turned from the window. The same way we've been handling Mercer all along, quietly, carefully, in a way that can't be traced back to us. Judd, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. Tom, listen, maybe we're overplaying this. Mercer's ranch is struggling anyway. Even if the horse lives, he's still short-handed, still behind on everything. Give it another year and he'll sell on his own. He won't sell, Tom said flatly. I know that man. I've been dealing with him for a decade. He'll hold on to that ranch until it kills him, and maybe after. The only way we get what we want is if we take it, and the only way we take it is if he's got nothing left to fight with. The horse and the girl, Marcus said, understanding. The horse and the girl. The brothers looked at each other in the firelight. Marcus was grinning, the way he grinned when things were about to get ugly. Judd's face was harder to read. He didn't smile, but he didn't object either, and in the Calloway family, silence was as good as consent. I'll handle it, Tom said. Both of them, within the week. Back at Silas's ranch, the night was quiet. Ash was sleeping. Real sleep, not the shallow, trembling unconsciousness of the past days, but deep, restorative sleep with steady breathing and relaxed muscles. Lena was sitting by the fire, writing in the notebook, adding her own observations to her mother's pages in handwriting that was smaller and tighter, but just as precise. Silas came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. She took it without looking up, and he sat down beside her and drank his own coffee and watched the stars. Emmett says people are talking, he said after a while. People are always talking. That's what people do. They're saying I've gone crazy, trusting an unknown woman instead of experienced ranchers, taking her into the canyons alone. They're making it sound like I seduced you into some kind of foolishness. I know. I've heard worse. Doesn't it bother you? She set down the pen and looked at him. The firelight caught her eyes and turned them amber, and for a moment she looked like someone completely different from the plain, forgettable woman who'd shown up at his fence, someone fierce and private and complicated in ways that no one in Ridgewater had ever bothered to discover. When I was 14, she said, my mother and I were living near a settlement called Barlow's Ferry. She'd helped a rancher save his breeding mare, colic, bad case. The horse would have died. She sat up with that animal for 3 straight nights. The rancher was grateful. His wife was not. She told everyone that my mother was a witch, that her medicine was dangerous, that she was corrupting the community with savage practices. We had to leave in the middle of the night because someone set fire to our wagon. She paused, sipped her coffee. So does it bother me that people in Ridgewater are whispering about me? Not particularly. I've been through worse, and this time the horse is going to live, and everybody's going to know it, and all the whispering in the world won't change what happened. Silas sat with that for a moment. The coffee was hot and bitter and exactly what he needed. For what it's worth, he said, I'm glad you showed up at my fence. That might be the nicest thing you've ever said to me. I'm not a nice man. I've noticed. She picked up the pen again and went back to writing, and the ghost of a smile, a real one this time, crossed her face and disappeared so quickly that if Silas had blinked, he would have missed it. But he didn't blink, and he didn't miss it. And something in his chest that had been frozen solid for longer than he cared to remember shifted, just slightly, like the first crack in a river of ice when spring comes and the current underneath starts moving again. He sat there beside her in the firelight and drank his coffee and watched his horse breathe, and for the first time in more years than he could count, the silence between 2 people felt like exactly the right amount of space. The fire came at 4 in the morning, when sleep sits heaviest and a man's instincts are slowest to wake him. Silas smelled it before he heard it. That acrid, particular smell of green wood burning fast, smoke carrying on a wind that shouldn't have had anything to push. He came up off his cot in the front room with his heart already pounding, and through the window he saw the orange glow climbing the night sky from the direction of the barn. Lena! She was already awake, already moving, pulling her boots on by the door. They'd set up a cot for her in the small side room weeks back, after that first long night with Ash, when it had stopped making sense for her to ride the 7 miles back to her uncle's place every evening. Neither of them had said much about what that meant. It just was what it was. Practical, necessary, and slowly becoming something neither of them wanted to examine too closely. They burst out onto the porch together, and the scene hit Silas like a fist to the chest. The barn was burning. Not smoldering, not catching, but burning, flames already climbing the east wall and licking along the roofline. The kind of fire that didn't start by accident. He could smell coal oil under the smoke, sharp and chemical, and that smell told him everything he needed to know about how this had started. "The horses," Lena said, already running. The corral sat 50 yards from the burning barn, close enough that the animals were screaming. That terrible high human-sounding scream horses make when fire is near, and they can't run from it. The bay mare was rearing against the fence rail, and beyond her, in the smaller paddock where he'd kept Ash through his recovery, the gray stallion was on his feet. On his feet. Weak still but standing, throwing his head and pulling against the rope that held him. Silas vaulted the corral fence and got to the mare first, fumbling with the gate latch while smoke rolled across the yard in thick, choking waves. His hands weren't working right. Panic did that to a man, stole the fine motor skill right out of his fingers, and he had to force himself to slow down, breathe, work the latch the way he'd worked it 10,000 times before. The gate swung open and the mare bolted past him into the dark, free, safe, gone. He turned toward Ash's paddock, and that was when the first shot rang out. It came from the tree line beyond the north fence, a flat crack that cut through the roar of the fire and the screaming of the animals, and the fence post 6 inches from Silas's head exploded into splinters. "Get down!" he shouted, and didn't wait to see if Lena obeyed. He dropped flat in the dirt, rolled toward the meager cover of a water trough, and pulled his pistol from where he'd shoved it into his waistband on the way out the door. A habit 14 years deep, the gun always within reach, even half asleep, even in his own yard. More shots followed. 3, 4, coming from at least 2 directions now, and in the strobing orange light of the burning barn, Silas caught glimpses of riders, dark shapes on horseback, moving along the fence line, rifles raised. He counted 5, maybe 6. Too many for 2 people and a sick horse to fight straight on. "Silas!" Lena's voice, somewhere off to his left, low and urgent. "They're coming through the gate." Oh! He looked and saw it was true. 2 riders had broken off from the tree line and were pushing their horses toward the open ranch gate, rifles braced against their shoulders, clearly meaning to drive straight into the yard. This wasn't sabotage anymore. This wasn't a burned fence post or a diverted creek or 30 head of cattle lost to a hard winter. This was men coming to finish something, and Silas understood with a cold, sick certainty that they meant to make sure nobody walked away from this who could tell a different story than the one Tom Calloway wanted told. He came up from behind the trough and fired twice at the lead rider, more to scatter than to hit. He wasn't going to make a clean shot at this range in this light, and he knew it. But it worked. The horse shied hard, throwing its rider off rhythm, and the second man pulled up to avoid colliding with the first. "Lena, the well house!" The well house was stone, thick-walled, the only real cover on the property besides the burning barn itself. "Get behind it." "What about Ash?" "I'll get him." He didn't have a plan beyond that. He just knew the horse was screaming and pulling at his tether, and the fire was close enough now that the heat of it pressed against Silas's face like a hand, and he wasn't going to stand here and watch the animal he'd spent 2 weeks fighting to save burn alive in his own paddock. He ran low across the yard, bullets kicking up dirt to his left, and reached the paddock rail just as another rider came around the side of the barn. Close, no more than 30 feet, rifle already swinging toward him. He didn't have time to aim. He fired from the hip, twice, and the second shot connected. The rider jerked sideways in the saddle, and the horse spooked and bolted, carrying its wounded passenger off into the dark. And Silas didn't wait to see what happened next. He got to Ash, fumbled the rope free with hands that were shaking now, full-on shaking, adrenaline burning through him in a way he hadn't felt since the war. "Easy," he said, even though his own voice wasn't easy at all. "Easy, boy. We're moving." Ash was weak. 2 weeks of fever and muscle wasting didn't undo itself in a matter of days, but he was upright. And when Silas pulled on the rope, the stallion came, stumbling but moving, away from the heat and the noise and the chaos. That was when the barn roof collapsed. It went with a sound like the world tearing, a deep groan followed by a rush of sparks and flame shooting 50 feet into the night sky, and the heat wave that came with it knocked Silas sideways. Ash reared, screaming, and for one terrible second Silas thought he'd lose the rope, lose the horse, watch him bolt straight into the gunfire. He didn't. The horse came down hard but stayed with him, trembling, eyes white-rimmed with terror, but staying. "This way!" Lena was at the corner of the well house, waving, and Silas dragged Ash toward her, half running, half stumbling, his lungs full of smoke and his ears full of gunfire, and the collapsing roar of the barn behind him. They made it behind the stone wall of the well house as another volley of shots chewed into the wood of the porch railing 20 feet away. Lena had Silas's spare rifle. She must have grabbed it on the way out, he realized, some part of his brain registering surprise even through the chaos. And she was already working the lever, chambering around with hands that were far steadier than his had any right to expect. "How many?" she asked. "5, maybe 6. I hit 1. They'll regroup, try to come at us from 2 sides. You know that how? I watched my mother face down men who wanted to burn us out twice. You learn the patterns." She peered around the edge of the wall, assessing, and pulled back fast as a bullet chipped stone 6 inches from her face. "There. 2 riders moving toward the east fence. They're going to try to flank us." Silas's mind was racing, trying to find an answer in terrain he knew better than any of these riders possibly could. And then it came to him. Not a plan exactly, but the shape of one, built from desperation and the one advantage he actually had. "The ravine," he said. "Behind the north pasture. Narrow cut, maybe 8 feet wide at the bottom, walls too steep for a horse to climb out either side. If we can get them to follow us in there, they'll have us trapped. No, we'll know the ground and they won't. That ravine runs uphill and narrows the further you go. Past the bend, it's barely wide enough for 1 horse at a time. Rifles aren't worth much when you can't see past the man directly in front of you, and horses panic in tight spaces they don't know." Lena looked at him for a half second, weighing it, and he watched her arrive at the same conclusion he had, that staying here, pinned behind a well house with the barn burning down and at least 4 armed men closing in, wasn't a position that improved with time. "Ash can't run far," she said. "He doesn't have to run far. He has to get us into that ravine, and then we go on foot, lead him through the narrow part. They'll either have to dismount and follow us in close quarters, which means we can fight them one at a time, or they'll hold back at the entrance, which buys us time to circle around behind them." "That's a hell of a gamble. You got a better idea?" She didn't. Nobody did. The fire was eating the barn down to its bones, throwing enough light across the yard that hiding wasn't really an option anymore, and the riders were already shifting position, working their way around toward the well house from 2 directions, just like she'd said they would. "All right," Lena said. "The ravine." They went out the backside of the well house, using its bulk as cover for as long as they could, then broke into a run across open ground toward the north pasture fence. Silas led Ash by the rope, the horse stumbling along beside him, doing more than anyone had a right to expect from an animal 2 weeks removed from death's door. Behind them, a shout went up. They'd been spotted, and gunfire opened up again, wild and unaimed in the dark, more noise than threat at this range. They reached the fence and Silas pulled 2 rails to make a gap wide enough for the horse, and they pushed through into the pasture beyond, the burning barn now a wall of orange light behind them, throwing long, jumping shadows across the grass. The ravine cut into the land about 200 yards north, a dry wash carved by decades of spring runoff, invisible until you were almost on top of it. Silas had ridden this ground 1,000 times and knew exactly where the entrance sat, knew exactly where it narrowed, knew exactly where a man on foot could find handholds in the rock that a man on horseback never would. They dropped down into the wash and the world changed instantly. The open sky replaced by close stone walls, the wind cut off, sound suddenly trapped and close and strange. Ash's hooves rang against the rock floor, too loud, impossible to hide. "They'll hear him," Lena said. "They'll hear him no matter what we do. Just keep moving." Behind them, the sound of riders reaching the pasture fence carried clear through the night air. Voices, low and urgent, and then the particular sound of men deciding to follow. Silas heard at least 3 horses come down into the wash behind them, hooves clattering on stone, and he pulled Ash forward faster, deeper into the narrowing channel, toward the bend where the walls pinched close enough that 2 riders couldn't pass side by side. "Here," he said when they reached it. "Past this point. Go." Lena went first, leading the way around the bend with the rifle held ready, and Silas followed with Ash, and the moment they cleared the turn, he stopped and pressed himself against the rock wall, motioning for Lena to do the same on the opposite side, leaving a few feet of open passage between them. Ash he led another 20 yards further up, tying the rope quick around an outcrop, hoping the horse would have the sense to stay put with gunfire echoing off the walls. It didn't, not entirely. Ash pulled and fretted against the rope, but there wasn't time to worry about that now. The first rider came around the bend at a careful walk, rifle up, eyes adjusting to the deeper dark of the narrow passage, and Silas let him get almost level before he stepped out from the wall. "That's far enough." The rider, Silas recognized him now, one of the Calloway hands, a younger man named Pruitt, froze, rifle half raised, caught in that terrible gap between deciding to shoot and deciding not to. He chose wrong. Silas fired first, and the man went down off his horse, and the horse itself spun in the narrow space, panicking, blocking the passage behind it completely. Exactly the way Silas had hoped one of them would. That left chaos behind the block, riders shouting, horses screaming and rearing in a space too tight to turn them around, men cursing as their mounts collided with stone walls and each other. Lena fired once over their heads, not trying to kill, just adding noise and fear to the confusion, and that was enough. Silas heard at least 2 riders abandon their horses and start scrambling back the way they'd come, on foot, no longer interested in whatever Tom Calloway had paid them to do tonight. But not all of them broke. One man pushed forward past the spinning, panicked horse. Marcus Calloway himself, Silas realized with a jolt, recognizing the build, the way he moved, and he came around the bend with murder plain on his face, rifle swinging up. Silas's gun was empty. He realized it in the same half-second he saw Marcus's rifle leveling at him, that terrible click of recognition that comes too late to matter, and there was nothing to do but throw himself sideways into the rock wall. The shot went wide, ricocheting off stone with a shriek, and the impact of it, or maybe just the sheer violence of the sound trapped in that narrow space, was enough to shake something loose above them. A chunk of the canyon wall, weakened maybe by years of water and frost, maybe just by bad luck arriving at the worst possible moment, broke away from 20 feet up and came down in a roar of dust and stone. "Lena, move!" Silas shouted, but she was already moving, scrambling back from where the rockfall was coming down. And in the chaos and the dust and the falling stone, Silas saw her foot catch on a loose rock, and she went down hard, right in the path of the slide. He didn't think. He just moved, throwing himself across the narrow space, getting his arms around her and rolling them both against the lee side of an outcrop a half-second before the bulk of the rockfall hit. Stone rained down around them, some of it striking Silas across the back and shoulders hard enough to make him grunt. But the outcrop held, shielding them from the worst of it. When the dust settled and the roar faded into silence, Silas became aware that he was lying half on top of Lena, both of them coated in pale dust, both of them breathing hard, and that the gunfire had stopped completely. The rock slide had done what bullets couldn't, ended the fight on its own terms. "You're bleeding," Lena said, her voice rough with dust and fear, reaching up to touch a gash along his temple he hadn't even felt happen. "I'm fine. You?" "I'm fine." She wasn't, quite. He could see her favoring her left ankle when she tried to sit up, could see the way she winced, but it wasn't the kind of hurt that would stop her, and that was all that mattered in the moment. They helped each other up. The rock slide had buried Marcus Calloway's escape route as completely as it had nearly buried them, leaving him trapped on the wrong side with the panicked, riderless horse, and no way back through except on foot, which was exactly how Silas found him 20 minutes later, sitting against the canyon wall, rifle discarded, hands raised, all the fight gone out of him. "Don't shoot," Marcus said. "Don't shoot. I'm done." Silas looked at him for a long moment, this man who'd ridden onto his land in the dark with coal oil and rifles, who'd burned his barn and tried to kill the woman who'd saved his horse, and he felt something hot and violent rise in his chest that he had to physically push down. "You're going to walk in front of me back to the house," Silas said, "and you're going to tell the sheriff everything, every name, every order, who paid for the coal oil and who gave the word. Tom will kill me." "Tom's problem just got a lot bigger than you." They walked Marcus out of the ravine as the eastern sky started to lighten from black to the deep blue gray that comes an hour before dawn. Behind them, the barn was a smoking ruin, and ahead of them the house stood untouched, and somewhere in the pasture Silas could hear Ash, his horse, his fierce, stubborn, impossibly resilient horse, calling out into the morning, alive and waiting to be found. The sheriff arrived before noon, a heavy-set, unhurried man named Asa Bell, who'd worn the badge in this territory for 11 years, and had long since stopped being surprised by what people did to each other over land and cattle. He brought 2 deputies and a wagon, and by the time he climbed down in front of the smoking ruin of Silas's barn, Marcus Calloway had been sitting on the porch steps for 6 hours with his wrists bound, sobering up fast and talking faster. "He's already told us most of it," Silas said, standing on the porch with Lena beside him, both of them still wearing the dust and exhaustion of the night before like a second skin. "Coal oil, the riders, who gave the order. He's scared enough of hanging that he's not bothering to protect anybody." Bell looked at Marcus, who wouldn't meet his eyes, and then at the barn, still smoldering in places, sending up thin gray threads of smoke into the bright morning sky. "And the man you shot in the paddock? Pruitt. He's alive, last I checked. Lena dug the bullet out and patched him before sunup. He's tied to the porch rail around back, and he's talked even more than Marcus has." "You 2 patched up a man who was trying to kill you." "Didn't seem right to let him bleed out for being stupid enough to work for Tom Calloway," Lena said. "Stupid isn't usually a capital offense around here, just careless." Bell almost smiled at that, the corner of his mouth twitching before he caught it and put his sheriff's face back on. He spent the next hour taking statements, from Silas, from Lena, from the wounded man on the porch, from Marcus, whose story kept growing more detailed and more damning with every retelling, as if he decided that the only way out of this was to make sure everyone understood it had been Tom's plan, Tom's money, Tom's coal oil, Tom's order to make sure nobody walked away who could tell a different story. "There's more," Marcus said at one point when Bell pressed him about the diverted creek, about the cattle lost 2 winters running, about all the small deniable cruelties that had been chipping away at Silas's operation for years. "Tom's been keeping records, ledgers, where the water gets dammed upstream during dry months, who got paid to look the other way when our cattle drifted onto Mercer land and got found, wandering back home with a few extra head mixed in. It's all in his office, locked drawer, bottom of his desk." Bell's eyebrows went up. "You're telling me to search your own brother's office?" "I'm telling you Tom's been planning to kill 2 people to keep his land grab quiet, and I don't aim to hang for being loyal to a man who'd have let it happen to me too if it meant the story stayed buried." Marcus's voice cracked on the last words, and whatever toughness he'd carried into the canyon the night before had burned off completely somewhere between the gunfire and the dawn. "I got a wife and a baby coming in the spring, Sheriff. I'm not dying for Tom Calloway's pasture." It took 2 more days for the full picture to come together, and when it did, it was worse than even Silas had suspected. The ledgers Marcus described were real, and they were damning. Years of documentation, written in Tom's own careful hand, detailing payments to hands willing to sabotage Silas's water rights, falsify brand counts, and discourage anyone who might step in to help him. There was a payment dated just 3 weeks back, the week Ash had first gone down, for a substance the ledger only called the draft. No further explanation, but Bell didn't need one once he cross-referenced it against the date and against a half-empty bottle of something foul-smelling that turned up in a search of the Calloway tack room. A bottle that matched almost exactly a description Lena gave of toxins her mother had once warned her could mimic a natural fever. "They poisoned him," Silas said, when Bell brought him the news, standing in what was left of the burned barn's foundation, kicking at a blackened timber with the toe of his boot. "Ash didn't get sick on his own. They poisoned my horse to force my hand." "Looks that way," Bell said. "Can't prove it beyond a doubt. Whatever was in that bottle, there's not enough left to test properly, and your horse lived, which makes it harder to build a case around. But between the fire, the gunfire, Marcus's confession, and these ledgers, we've got Tom Calloway dead to rights on arson, attempted murder, and about 6 different flavors of theft and fraud. That's more than enough to see him spend the rest of his natural life somewhere he won't be buying anybody's pasture. Tom didn't come quietly. When Bell and his deputies rode out to the Calloway Ranch with a warrant, Tom barricaded himself in the main house for the better part of an afternoon, shouting through a window about how none of this would matter, how he had friends in the territorial government, how Silas Mercer was a broken man riding the coattails of a woman who didn't know her place. It was Judd, in the end, who talked him down. Judd, who'd been the quietest of the 3 brothers all along, who walked up to that window with his hands open and his voice steady and told Tom that it was over, that there wasn't a version of this where it ended any other way, and that the only choice left was how much more damage he wanted to do on his way down. Tom surrendered just before dark. He didn't look at Silas when they let him out in irons. Wouldn't, even when Silas stood not 20 feet away, watching the whole thing with an expression that held no satisfaction in it at all, just a tired, hollowed-out relief that it was finally over. The town's reaction came slower than the legal proceedings, but it came with its own kind of force. The same people who'd whispered about Silas's foolishness, who'd laughed at Lena behind their hands, who'd called her invisible and insignificant and worse, started showing up at the ranch with offers of help. Emmett Dawes organized a barn raising before the week was out, and men who'd never said 2 words to Silas in passing showed up with lumber and tools and an apologetic kind of energy that suggested they understood, somewhere underneath the friendly small talk, that they'd been on the wrong side of something without ever quite admitting it to themselves. Virgil Dean, from behind the counter of the general store, told anyone who'd listened that he'd always said the Whitlock girl had something special about her, which wasn't strictly true but wasn't worth arguing about either. Old Mrs. Patterson, whose daughter Ruth had once been offered to Silas as a sensible match, made a point of stopping Lena in the street to say, in a voice loud enough to carry, that she hoped the girl knew how much good she'd done for this community, finding that cure, standing her ground. Lena took all of it with the same steady composure she brought to everything, but Silas noticed the way her shoulders sat a little differently after each encounter. Not relaxed exactly, because 4 years of being overlooked didn't unwind in a week, but lighter. Like a weight she'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it had gotten, was finally, piece by piece, being set down. Ash's recovery through all of this continued at its own steady pace. By the 10th day after the fire, he was walking the length of the paddock on his own, slow but sure, his coat regaining its shine, his appetite roaring back hard enough that Silas had to ration his feed to keep him from overdoing it. By the 3rd week, he was cantering, wobbly at first, then stronger, until one bright morning Silas turned him loose in the north pasture and watched him run flat out across the grass for the sheer joy of having legs that worked again, mane and tail streaming, kicking up his heels like a colt. Silas stood at the fence and watched, and beside him, Lena stood watching too, and neither of them said anything for a long time because there wasn't anything that needed saying. The horse that the whole territory had written off as dead was alive and running, and the woman everyone had dismissed as nothing was the reason why, and somewhere in the space between those 2 facts, something had shifted permanently in how Ridgewater understood the order of things. "He's never going to thank you," Silas said eventually. "Not in any way you'd recognize." "He doesn't need to. I can see it. The way he comes to the fence when I'm near. The way he doesn't spook anymore when I touch his legs. That's thanks enough." "It's not just him." She looked over at him, and he found, to his own mild surprise, that he didn't look away. "I know what I owe you," he said. "Not just for the horse, for showing me what I'd let myself become. Hard and closed off, and so sure that trusting people only ended one way that I never gave anybody a fair chance to prove otherwise. You gave me one. You didn't give me much choice. You stood at my fence and told me my horse didn't have to die. And you said it like you'd already decided the conversation was over, and the only question left was whether I'd catch up. That's about right." The smile came easier now, more often, less guarded than it had been even a few weeks back. "I told you, patience isn't popular, but it works on almost everything." The barn went up faster than anyone expected. 6 days from bare foundation to a finished frame, with half the men in the valley showing up to lend a hand, and the women bringing food enough to feed a small army. And by the end of it, the structure standing in the yard looked sturdier and better built than the one that had burned, as if the whole community had decided, without saying so out loud, to make sure Silas Mercer's ranch came back stronger than it had ever been. Tom Calloway's trial happened in the territorial seat 3 weeks later, and Silas and Lena both rode out to testify, along with Marcus, whose cooperation earned him a lighter sentence than his brother, but didn't spare him prison time entirely. Judd, who talked Tom down from the window and had no direct hand in the violence, kept the Calloway Ranch running under a cloud of suspicion that would follow the family name for years. But he ran it honestly from that point forward, paid every debt the family owed, and never once tried to so much as look sideways at Silas's land again. When the jury came back with their verdict, guilty on every count, there was no triumph in the room, just the particular weary satisfaction of watching something rotten get cut out before it could spread any further. Silas sat through the reading of the sentence with Lena beside him, her hand resting near his on the wooden bench, not quite touching, and when it was over they walked out into the afternoon light together without saying much of anything, because there wasn't much left that needed to be said. The ride back to Ridgewater took the better part of 2 days, and they made camp the first night in open country, under a sky thick with stars, the kind of sky that made a person feel both impossibly small and strangely steady at the same time. "What happens now?" Lena asked, sitting by the fire, her knees drawn up to her chest, watching the flames the way she always did, like she was reading something in them that nobody else could see. "Now I rebuild, properly, this time. New stock, fences fixed right, that creek running clean again with nobody upstream choking it off." Silas paused, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I was thinking I might need help, more than Emmett dropping by. Somebody who knows the land, knows the animals, isn't scared off by hard work or bad odds." "Sounds like you're looking for a foreman." "Sounds like I'm looking for something I don't quite have the words for yet." She looked at him across the fire, and for once she didn't fill the silence with something practical. She just let it sit there, let him work toward whatever he was trying to say, the same patience she'd shown him in the canyons, on the cliff face, beside Ash's sickbed at 3 in the morning when the fever wouldn't break and neither of them knew if the horse would see daylight. "I'm not going anywhere, Silas," she said finally. "Not unless you ask me to." "I'm not going to ask you to." "Then I suppose that settles it." The fire popped and threw sparks up into the dark, and somewhere out in the grassland a coyote called, and Ash, picketed nearby, lifted his head at the sound and then settled again, unbothered, strong, alive. Silas looked at the woman across the fire, the one the whole territory had once called insignificant, the one who'd walked into canyon country on nothing but her dead mother's notebook and her own stubborn certainty, the one who'd held a rifle steady in a collapsing ravine and never once flinched. And he understood, with a clarity that surprised him in its simplicity, that the life he'd spent years protecting himself from wasn't a threat at all. It was sitting right there across the fire, waiting on him to stop being afraid of it. Spring came hard the following year, the way it sometimes did in that country, going from frost to green in a matter of weeks. And by the time the wildflowers came up along the creek bottom, Silas Mercer's ranch didn't look like the same place that had nearly burned to the ground 8 months before. The new barn stood broader than the old one, with a second loft added on at Lena's insistence, because she said a ranch that meant to grow needed room to grow into. The fences ran straight and tight all the way to the foothills. The creek ran clean and full, no longer choked off by some dam thrown up in secret on Calloway land, and the herd had grown from the sorry, depleted handful Silas had been nursing along to a respectable spread of cattle that he'd bought back with money earned, in part, from something neither of them had quite expected. People started coming for the herbs. It began small. A rancher 2 valleys over with a colicky mule who'd heard the story of Ash through the kind of telling and retelling that turns a true thing into something close to legend by the time it travels 50 miles. He showed up at the gate one morning, hat in hand, asking if the Whitlock woman might take a look at his animal. Lena went, treated the mule, refused payment beyond a fair price for her time, and the man told 2 other men, and within a season she had more requests than she could keep up with. Sick horses, ailing cattle, a prize bull up near Wardell that the local stockman swore was finished until Lena spent 4 days working over him with poultices and patience and brought him back from the edge. She kept her mother's notebook close through all of it, copying pages, adding her own notes in the margins, building something that had started as one woman's careful observations into a body of knowledge that traveled from ranch to ranch on the strength of results nobody could argue with. The same people who'd once called her insignificant now rode considerable distances to learn what she knew, and she taught them plainly, without resentment, because she'd decided somewhere along the way that proving people wrong mattered less than making sure the knowledge didn't die with her the way it had nearly died with her mother. "You could charge twice what you're charging," Silas told her one evening, watching her grind dried herbs at the kitchen table by lamplight. "Folks would pay it. They'd pay more than that." "I know, but you won't. My mother charged what people could afford and sometimes less than that, and she still ended up run out of 2 towns by men who decided her knowing things was a threat to them. Money never bought her safety. Being useful to enough people who'd stand up for her when it mattered, that's what would have helped if she'd had the time to build it. So no, I'm not going to charge what the market would bear. I'm going to make sure that if anybody ever tries to run me off again, half this territory remembers I saved something they loved." Silas didn't argue with that. He'd stopped arguing with most of what Lena said a long time back, not because he agreed with everything, but because she'd earned the right to be heard out fully before anybody offered an opinion, and more often than not, by the time she finished explaining herself, there wasn't much left to argue about anyway. Ash had come back from the edge of death into something that looked, by midsummer, almost like his old self. Gray coat gleaming, muscle filled back out, the same watchful, steady presence at the fence line he'd always been. He wasn't young anymore. The illness had cost him something that didn't fully come back, a slight stiffness in his hindquarters on cold mornings, a willingness to let the bay mare and the new geldings handle the harder work while he grazed in the home pasture like a retired soldier who'd earned the right to rest. But he was alive, and he still came to the fence every time Silas's boots hit the porch steps, and that, as far as Silas was concerned, was the only accounting that mattered. The town of Ridgewater had changed too, in smaller, quieter ways. Tom Calloway's trial and the unraveling of everything he'd built through fear and money had left a mark on the place. Not dramatic, not the kind of change you could point to and name, but a shift all the same. People talked a little less about who owned what and a little more about who'd helped whom. Judd Calloway ran the family ranch with a different hand than his brother had, paid his debts square, and twice in the following year sent riders over to help Silas during branding season without being asked, as if he understood that some debts couldn't be settled with money and had to be paid down slow, year after year, through ordinary decency. It was late summer when Silas finally said what he'd been carrying around for months, the words sitting in his chest like a stone he kept meaning to set down, and kept finding reasons to carry a little further. He'd planned it in his own clumsy way, picked a Saturday when the harvest dance was happening at the Grange Hall, the same hall he hadn't set foot in since the year Catherine left, because some part of him understood that he needed to walk back into that room and prove to himself it didn't own him anymore. Lena wore a blue dress she'd made herself from cloth she'd bought with her own earned money, and when Silas saw her come down the porch steps that evening, something in his chest did a thing he didn't have a polished word for. Not the desperate, hungry feeling he remembered from being young and foolish over Catherine, but something steadier, something that felt less like falling and more like finally standing on solid ground after years of walking on uncertain footing. The Grange Hall was full that night, lanterns strung along the rafters, a fiddle and a guitar working through reels that had half the floor stomping in time. People who'd once whispered about Silas Mercer's foolishness now nodded to him as he came through the door, and a few even smiled, which was as close as Ridgewater got to an apology for years of small cruelties nobody wanted to name out loud. He danced with her. Badly, at first. He hadn't done it in 15 years, and his feet remembered the steps about as well as a man remembers a language he hasn't spoken since childhood. But Lena laughed, actually laughed, the kind of unguarded sound he'd only heard from her a handful of times. And by the third song, he'd found something close to rhythm again. They stepped outside between songs to catch their breath, out into the cool night air, the music still drifting through the open windows behind them. And Silas found himself standing under the same stars that had watched over them in the canyons, over Ash's sickbed, over the ravine where they'd nearly died together. "I've been thinking," he said. "That's usually dangerous for you." "Probably." He turned to face her properly. "I spent a long time deciding that trusting people only ended one way. I had proof, or I thought I did. And then you showed up at my fence and told me my horse didn't have to die. And you were right about that. And you kept being right about things, over and over, until I ran out of reasons to keep believing what I'd decided to believe." "That's a long way of saying something, Silas." "I'm getting there." He pulled in a breath. "I don't want a foreman, Lena. I never did. I want a partner. Someone who's already rebuilt half this ranch with her own two hands and her own hard-won knowledge, who stood in a ravine with a rifle and didn't run, who's earned every bit of respect this territory's finally started giving her. I'm asking you to stand beside me, not because you saved my horse, though you did, and not because you saved this ranch, though you did that too. I'm asking because somewhere between the canyons and the fire and everything after, I stopped being able to picture any version of my life that doesn't have you in it." She was quiet for a moment, and in the lantern light spilling from the hall windows, he could see her working through it, weighing the words the way she weighed everything, carefully, without rushing toward an answer just because one was expected. "You understand what you're asking," she said finally. "Not just a wife, a partner. Someone who's going to keep doing the work I do, keep teaching what I know, keep being exactly as stubborn as I've always been. I'm counting on it. And if people talk, if they say you married beneath you, or that I trapped you somehow with herbs and good timing, let them talk. I spent 14 years listening to what this territory thought I should do, and the only time any of it turned out worth a damn was the one time I ignored every bit of advice and let a woman everybody else dismissed lead me into canyon country on nothing but her mother's notebook and her own certainty. I'm done caring what gets said in the rusty spur." The smile that came over her face then was different from any he'd seen before. Not the small, careful smile she rationed out like she wasn't sure she'd earned the right to it, but something open and real, something that reached all the way to her eyes. "Then yes," she said, "I'll stand beside you." They were married in October, a year almost to the day since Ash had collapsed in the dust, and the whole territory had whispered that Silas Mercer had finally lost everything. The ceremony was small, held at the ranch itself, under the new barn's wide eaves with the autumn light slanting gold across the yard. Emmett Dawes stood up for Silas. Half of Ridgewater came, including people who'd once crossed the street to avoid speaking to either of them, because that was how small towns worked. They forgot their cruelties faster than the people on the receiving end ever could, and the only thing to do about it was let them come. Let them eat the food and dance the dances and pretend the years of dismissal had never happened, because holding on to that bitterness would have cost more than it was worth. Ash stood at the paddock fence through the whole ceremony, watching, the way he always watched, as if he understood, in whatever way a horse understands anything, that something important was happening and his job was simply to witness it. The years that followed weren't smooth. Nothing about that country ever was. There were dry seasons that tested the creek's new clean flow, and sick cattle that didn't always pull through no matter what Lena tried, and arguments between two stubborn people who'd both spent too long managing on their own to fold easily into managing together. Silas learned, slowly, that loving someone didn't mean the walls came down all at once, that some mornings he still woke with the old caution sitting heavy in his chest, the fear that comfort was something the world eventually took back. Lena learned that being seen, after years of being overlooked, came with its own kind of weight. The responsibility of mattering to someone, of being depended on, of no longer being able to disappear into the background when things got hard. But they built something real out of all of it, the kind of life that doesn't announce itself with fireworks but proves itself in smaller ways day after day, in the way Silas started fixing things before they broke, instead of waiting for disaster the way he used to, in the way Lena stopped flinching when people praised her work, in the way the ranch grew not because either of them got lucky, but because two people who refused to quit kept showing up for each other and for the land, season after season, through everything that tried to break them. Ash lived another 6 years past the night he nearly died, long enough to grow gray-muzzled and slow, long enough to watch from his pasture as a new generation of horses came up under Silas and Lena's care, long enough that when he finally did go, peacefully, in his sleep, in the same paddock where Lena had first knelt beside him, with a stranger's certainty and a dead woman's notebook. It felt less like a tragedy and more like the closing of a long, well-lived story. Silas buried him on the rise overlooking the creek, where the water ran clean now, where the grass grew thick and green every spring, and he didn't cry in front of anyone. But Lena found him out there alone that evening, sitting against the fresh-turned earth, and she didn't say anything either. She just sat down beside him and stayed until the stars came out, because some grief doesn't need words, only company. The ranch that Tom Calloway had once tried to take through fire and fear became, in time, one of the strongest operations in the territory. So, not the biggest, never the biggest, but the one people pointed to when they wanted to talk about what stubbornness and decency could build if you gave them enough years to work. Travelers came from 3 counties over to learn Lena's methods. Young ranchers who'd grown up hearing the story the way Silas himself had once heard stories of other men's hard luck and harder triumphs, came looking for advice on everything from sick livestock to difficult land to the simple, unglamorous work of holding on to something worth keeping. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the light was going gold over the foothills, Silas would think back to the man he'd been the day ash collapsed in the dust, closed off, certain that trust was a door better left shut, certain that the only safe way to move through the world was alone. He never fully became a different man. The caution stayed with him, the way old wounds always leave some trace behind. But he'd learned, finally, after 41 hard years of getting it wrong, that the things worth having in this life rarely arrived wrapped in the packaging you expected. Sometimes they showed up plain and overlooked at your fence line, carrying nothing but a dead woman's notebook and a stubborn, unshakable belief that what everyone else called impossible was simply a problem nobody had been patient enough to solve. That, in the end, was the whole of what he'd come to understand. Loyalty wasn't loud. Courage didn't always look like the thing people expected it to look like. And the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones the world walked past without a second glance, they were so often carrying in plain sight exactly what a broken man needed to finally come home to himself.